We're going to continue a series we started last week called Follow Me. No, not me, all right? Not Jared, not Kevin. Follow me. Follow Jesus. Something he said often to the people that he came into contact with 2,000 years ago. And it's so cool to think like, oh, what would it have been like if I had lived when Jesus was here physically? But the truth of the matter is, most of the people that Jesus invited to follow him did not follow him. So don't fool yourself into thinking like, if I could see him physically, I'd probably believe more. No, traditionally, probably not. Statistically, probably not. Because faith is not in what you can see and touch and feel. It's what you can't see. It's what you can't really explain sometimes. It's what you can't hear, what you can't visualize. It's something that honestly makes no sense. And that's why faith works. And when Jesus would invite people to follow him, he would say things to them. So this week we're going to talk about follow me, but I'm going to add a little something to it. Follow me, but count the cost. Because this is something Jesus did in Luke chapter 14. There was a multitude following him, and he kept turning and looking over his shoulder and saying, wow, there's a lot of people following me. Wow, there's a lot of people following me. And his disciples knew it was about to happen next, and they didn't like it. Because Jesus would do this thing where when too many people were following him, he would talk some of them away. He would talk some of them out of it. Like they would start following him and be like, hey, guess what? A lot of you are going to die. What? I'm out of here, man. I thought this was something else. I thought it was a circus or something. I don't know what you were thinking. And his disciples couldn't stand it because they're like, Jesus, we're growing. There's people. Why do you keep talking them out? It'd be like if like this morning, it was a little crowded when the kids were in here. That's great. Like when we fill in here and there's a lot more people, and that's awesome. It'd be like if I got up here and said, hey, I don't like half of you. You look funny. Please leave. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those things like, why would you do that? And his disciples were like, Jesus, he's like, you don't get it. This is not for the faint of heart. This is not something that's just a little fun season of your life. This is going to be hard. This is going to be dangerous. This is going to be reckless. And so I want you to know it. So in this passage we're going to read, Jesus is walking around and he keeps looking over his shoulder and there's a bigger crowd. Now the truth of the matter is, it's because of the time of year. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem, and a lot of these people are too, because it's time of Passover. And so his multitude is growing, and as is always the case, the multitude is full of people who believe and who wonder and who don't believe and who maybe just are considering it. And the truth is, that's what most of our churches are filled with today. There are some who, man, I believe it. I believe it, every bit of it. There are some who say, I want to believe, but Lord, help my unbelief. Lord, help me to have faith. And there are some who, I'm still pretty skeptical, but I'm curious. And there were a lot of curious followers. And so Jesus wanted to take a minute and just be crystal clear with them. And I got to say, I love it when somebody's crystal clear, even if I disagree with them. You know what I mean? Don't lead me along. Don't just tell me what I want to hear. You know, it's funny. It's that time of year. I feel like it's always election season, but it's election season again. And there are lots of people on the radio and on TV telling me what I want to hear. You know what I mean? Like they say things, they're generic enough. They're all these great ideas and what great speeches they give, but when it comes right down to it, some of them are still kind of loose on what they're actually going to do or how they're going to do it. And what I love about Jesus was he would turn around and say, listen, this is how it is. This is what following me looks like. And this is one of those times. So if you've been following Jesus for a long time, maybe you've been following him for a few weeks, whatever it may be, this morning we're going to talk about counting the cost for what it looks like to follow Jesus. Luke chapter 14, I'm going to begin reading in verse 25. You can read along with me on the screen. Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And you can just feel Peter say, oh no, that's crazy. Why would he say that? There's no purpose there. Now, truthfully, that word hate is strong, and the Hebrew text, or the Hebrews when they spoke, they would use that word, and they didn't mean hate like we use it. It kind of goes back to Old Testament when Jacob it said that his love for Rachel and he hated Leah. It wasn't that he hated Leah. It was that his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, okay? And that's the same word play here. Jesus isn't saying if you become a follower of Jesus, you need to hate everyone. He's saying your love for them pales in comparison with your love for him, okay? So don't misinterpret that, because that does sound really crazy. But it is still crazy to think that Jesus is calling you to love him more than your wife, than your own mother, your Father than your children. Well, that's hard. But he says, I want you to understand what's at play here. I'm not asking for your time. I'm not asking for your affection. I'm not asking for you to be like, yeah, I'm a Jesus fan. He said, I want you to know your love for me has to run deep. Verse 27. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. This is strong language. This isn't like, if you want to be a disciple, you probably should. He said, you can't unless you this. And remember, this is pre-Christianity, okay? This is way before the cross was cool and the cross was hip and the cross was on every church logo or church steeple. The cross was a form of execution, all right? It's crazy to talk about. Nobody wanted to talk about it. When you said cross, they thought pain, torture, humiliation, naked bodies dying slowly in the sun, okay? Not cool. It's cool now, but it wasn't then. It was awful. It was the embodiment of years and years of research the Romans had done into finding the most painful way to kill someone. You know, we live in a society where if someone is going to die, if someone is going to be executed, we have to do it quickly and as painlessly as possible. The Romans were exactly opposite. How can we stretch this out over 2 to 3 days? And sometimes it did take that long. How can we make this as painful as possible? So he says, take your cross and bear it. Verse 28. For which of you, and this is where I want us to focus, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Is there anything more embarrassing than starting a project and letting everyone on Facebook know that you're starting that project, that diet, that goal, that business, whatever it is? Right? It's bad. And then weeks later, quietly shutting down that page, quietly under the comments, we no longer exist, we're not doing that, dieting isn't for me. Like, it's embarrassing to start something and then not follow through. And I just got to be real with you. It's very easy for people to commit their lives to follow Jesus. Like, yeah, I want to follow Jesus. It's very hard to actually do it on a day-to-day basis. That's not me making excuses. That's me just being honest with you. It's hard to follow Jesus, and this is why. So he said, before you commit, I want you to know it's better to just not commit if you've counted the cost and said it's just not worth it. So this morning, we're going to do a little bit of a risk-reward. You guys know I like risk rewards. What is the risk? What is the reward? Is it worth it for this investment of time, resources, and life? All right? So he says, who would not sit down and first count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? He was speaking to a group of people who were under the rule of Herod. And while Herod was the leader there in that particular part of the world, he had a lot of building projects going on. He loved spending money on big, glorious, awesome buildings. And as is often the case, when a leader does that, the architecture of the surrounding area often begins to look like it. That's why here in Portsmouth, you see a lot of old federal homes or even colonial homes, because we have some of the oldest homes in the area here. Whatever the government or the leaders were doing, people would try to build and mimic a smaller version of that. And so the same was true here. As Herod began building big, glorious, awesome buildings, people thought, I need a nice building. My home should kind of resemble his palace, maybe just a little bit scaled down, you know what I mean? It was like pre-HGTV, but everybody wanted to be in a bigger home, in a cooler home. So people would start these projects. And there was some, embarrassment when you couldn't finish that project. And like most communities, you could walk around, you could see homes that the project had started, but it wasn't finished. You know what I mean? Foundation was there, the walls were there, no roof yet. Or maybe it was an upgrade. They were just adding a room, but it was still just framed in, and they didn't have the resources to finish it. And what Jesus was saying was, isn't that embarrassing? Let's avoid that embarrassment here. Sit down and count the cost first. Keep reading. Verse 29. Lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Make no mistake about it. Jesus is passionate about people following after him. But there's nothing more embarrassing and harmful to the cause of Christ than people committing their life to follow Jesus and then they can't follow through or they won't follow through. The cost was too high. I didn't understand. I wasn't clear. I didn't know. And Jesus wants to be clear. So I find it an obligation as a pastor to be extremely clear with you this morning. If you're on the fence, or maybe you've decided to follow Jesus, or maybe you haven't decided yet, I want you to know that this is not a small ambition. This is not something that will take it's like coaching Little League, or it's like investing in a small business, or it's like starting your own side business. This is something big. This is something that is a commitment longer than 5 years, 6 months, or a week. It's a real commitment of time, energy, and efforts. And so I want us to talk this morning about, is it worth it? And there may be some of you this morning who walk away saying, it is not worth it. And here's what I would say, and this is going to sound awful to some of you. It is better for you to do that. It is better for you to do that than for you to commit and then walk away later. It is better for you to do that than to start something and get hurt, and to start something and to not have really committed and it put a sour taste in your mouth to the church, to Jesus and his kingdom, and a sour taste in others' mouths. Because here's the truth. If you're not ready to commit, this is dangerous and it is crazy, and many left following Jesus, and it crippled them. Read on. He uses another illustration that was good for them at that time, and even our time. Or what king, going to make war against another king, does not sit down first and consider whether he is able to meet with 10,000 men those who come against him with 20,000? Or else, while there is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Now, there's some words there that kind of scare you, and I'm not going to walk them back, but I want to make something clear to you. Jesus is not saying that when you become a follower of Christ, you abandon your home, your car, your job, all that. No, he's saying, in comparison, your love for him is greater than that, and if it came down to it, you would choose Jesus over your comfort. You would choose Jesus over that job. You would choose Jesus over fill in the blank. So it is crazy, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. It's not, right now, you got to give it all up, but you need to be willing to do that. And many of the followers here, they did just that. When it came right down to it, many of them found themselves 2 years later, 5 years later, some of them 30 years later, they found themselves sitting in prison with this understanding. If you will just renounce Jesus, just say all those things you said you saw didn't happen. Just say you never saw him after he died. Just say you never saw him come back from the dead. Just say you never saw these things. We'll let you go. You can go back to your work. You can have a job. You can do everything you used to do, and your life will be cozy. And they said no, and they died. That is what it looks like to have a love for Christ that is greater than all else. And here's the problem. We don't live like that, do we? Right now, there's nobody hunting you down because you're a Christian, because you went to church this morning. It's easy to go to church. It's easy to be an American Christian. You know what I'm saying? It's not illegal here. Thank the Lord. I'm thankful for that. We can worship however we please. That's awesome. That's great. But sometimes what that does is it inoculates us to the truth that we have brothers and sisters in India. We have brothers and sisters in Africa, in the Middle East, who could die tomorrow because they believe in Jesus. And you know what they said? They said, I'm willing. It's worth it. And that's a very far stretch from where many of us as Americans find ourselves in the ease and comfort of American Christianity. And so this morning, I want to walk us back, not through American Christianity, not through modern Christianity, but what did it look like to be a follower of Jesus on day one? What was the risk that was associated with it? In another passage similar to this one, he said, you will be thrown from the temple. You will be outcast from the synagogue, and your life will be uprooted because of following me. Now, that doesn't sound like much to you. You're like, yeah, big deal. I've left churches before. I've been thrown out of churches. I've been, you fill in the blank from some religious group. This was different because these individuals grew up in a Hebrew society. And when you were thrown out of the synagogue, it completely changed your life. You were considered unclean. And as an unclean individual, it was very hard to get a job, very hard to find a relationship. No one would date you. No one would marry their daughter to you. No way. You're crazy. So there went your income. There went your relationship status. No one was to be seen talking to an unclean person. So for Jesus to say, to follow me means you're going to get thrown out of the temple. And as a matter of fact, they're not just going to throw you out of the temple. Many of them will persecute you, and they'll think they're doing it to honor God. Now, some of that still happens today. There are people who think they're honoring God by persecuting and killing others. And that is awful. But that happened to them then, and it still happens now. And so when they said, I'm going to follow Jesus, it was an understanding. When they signed their name on the dotted line, so to speak, there was something hard coming their way. So here's the deal. There's a lot of risk here. You're not going to be popular. You're going to have trouble finding a job. You're going to be considered unclean. So I think most of us will be thinking, well, then why did anyone follow this guy? It's all awful. Because so far we've only talked about the risk. Jesus also outlined the reward. When they would follow him, he would look back and he would say, it's going to be hard, but you know what? You're going to find purpose in life you've never had to this point. The Old Testament is great and it's full of laws, but those laws were always meant to point towards your weakness and your inability to meet those laws. And I am finally going to meet and satisfy the law in me so that you can find grace, you can find purpose, you can find healing in me that you could never find on your own through religion or through obeying and keeping and practicing laws. I am the fulfillment of those laws. There's something greater. That was a great reward. Many of them that caught on with them. He would also tell them of a kingdom. Now, many of them misunderstood the kingdom. They thought the kingdom was this physical kingdom, that he was going to elect officers and presidents and kings, and that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about a spiritual kingdom that would have its place here, but would ultimately find its place in heaven and an eternity spent with him, and that is a great reward, and that's the reward most people focus on. Well, I better go to church so I go to heaven, don't go to hell. That's only part of it. Following Jesus is about so much more than avoiding the penalty of sin, than avoiding an eternity separated from God. It's about the joy and the life that has filled with purpose here through Jesus and following him. And finding a greater purpose in ourselves, and finally, hearing somebody say to us, hearing somebody say to them 2,000 years ago, looking over his shoulder, if you're going to follow me, it's no longer about you. And this was contradicting everything every religious leader had ever said. Every great religion promises, if you'll follow me, you'll be blessed. If you'll follow me, I'll make something great of you. If you'll follow me, I'll have a special place in heaven for you. There'll be X amount of virgins waiting for you. There'll be all these riches at your fingertips. And that's not what God promised. Jesus would look over his shoulder and say, if you'll follow me, I'll help you discover that life is no longer about you, and a life living for others is greater than a life living for yourself could have ever been. Now, that does sound crazy until you've experienced what it's like to give of yourself to others. When you've experienced that, there is no turning back, there is no looking back, because that is greater. That is a different life. That is a life filled with purpose. Because Jesus knew that every day, these individuals 2,000 years ago, just like you, they wrestled with those same three questions we talk about often here. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And what happens to me after this? And Jesus answered all of those questions. He helped them discover their purpose here, where they came from, and where God wanted to take them. And that answers the wrestling, gnawing spirit of the human heart. And so he was clear here. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. And he used the illustration of making war because he knew, and it would come to take place years later, that Israel was going to experience a war. And they were not going to count the cost properly. It would be overrun around AD 70, 72. And they knew what that looked like. They had seen leaders miscalculate what war would cost them. But more than that, there's a reason Jesus used the building of a house and war to illustrate this. Because those are the two different compartments of our life as a believer. As a believer, the first thing we're to do is to build up our spiritual identity, our spiritual life, our spiritual house, and to grow in our relationship with Jesus. And that takes effort, it takes time, it takes patience, and that's a working on ourselves through the Holy Spirit. But there's also a warring that takes place. Do you know what I mean? Because there is a world surrounding us that wants to overtake us. There are enemies that we have, like materialism and selfishness, and they war against what we are all about. There is an enemy around us that would like to take from us our faith, and they war against us. And Jesus says, I want you to know the risk here, and I want you to calculate what it's going to take. I want you to know you're not going to be popular. For the last 50 years, the church in America has enjoyed a great position in society and in culture, where we've been somewhat popular, pretty popular as a matter of fact, and we didn't bother anybody and nobody bothered us, and we got comfortable thinking the America and the church are always going to be married together. And here's the truth of the matter. That is not the case. It is much more difficult to, not difficult, I shouldn't say it that way. It is very different to be a Christian right now than it was 10 years ago. We are viewed very differently. And in the next 10 years, I'm just going to tell you, some of these verses are going to start making much better sense to us as followers of Jesus, because we will not be popular anymore. We won't. And if all we were doing was going to church because it was popular, we'll see who was actually following Jesus and who was doing it because it was popular. And let me remind you, in this passage, it was popular to follow Jesus until he turned around and explained it, and then it was unpopular again. The day that Jesus died, right, and the day that he resurrected, how many believers were left? It was about 120. But there was 5,000 that he fed that one time, right, because he was giving away food. And he was teaching on a hillside. There were thousands that followed. You're right. There were thousands that followed, but there was 120 that saw it through. That's how the church works. Historically, there have been seasons where the church has been extremely popular and where it has not been so popular. For the first few hundred years, it was very dangerous to be a believer in Jesus. Then, something changed in human culture and human history, and it was not only safe. A Roman ruler said, you have to be a Christian. Well, then we had a whole new host of problems. Here's what I'm telling you. Don't follow Jesus because it's popular. It shouldn't be, but even when it is, it won't last. And I just have to warn you, following Jesus, his teachings, they're encouraging sometimes. You could flip over a few pages and it's like, blessed are those who take care of the poor. And everybody's like, yeah, Jesus, such a good teacher, so great. Just love what he says. And then they turn over here and they're like, hate your father. That Jesus, he was confused sometimes, but what he said for the most part was pretty good. You know, you got to take the good with the bad, and people walk it back. Here's the truth. When you follow Jesus and what he says, there are going to be some people who don't like it. We live in a society where, listen, there's Christians, there's Muslims, there's Jews, there's Hindus, there's Buddhists, there's all kinds of people in this society. And for this long, we have coexisted fine. But here's the truth. There may be a day where it's not popular. You may get called to move to a country where it's illegal to worship Jesus. Here's what I want you to know. There is risk in following Jesus. And if you haven't thought about that, if you're only following him because it's fun or cool, I want you to know Jesus himself would say, you need to sit down and think about this. Now, to this point in the message, some of you may be thinking, Mark's trying to talk me out of following Jesus. This is crazy. I'm not. I'm really not. But I'm trying to be honest with you. Whenever somebody asks me something, I always try to be honest with them. This past couple of weeks, my wife and I have been trying to rent out a property that we own, and I've had 20 different showings, and every showing ends the same way. And I tell them, it's going to sound like I'm trying to talk you out of it, but we're being very careful because we want a good tenant in here. The last one was in there for 3 years. The one before that was 2 years. We're looking for good tenants that are going to last a long time. So if I talk you out of it, it's kind of on purpose. The same principle applies here. Jesus is trying to talk them out of it because he's not interested in 2-week commitments. He's not interested in 2-year commitments. He's interested in a lifetime commitment. So let's put it this way. What are the risks? Well, we've heard them. Unpopular. And these people are giving up their lives, many of them. What's the reward? The reward is something you can't put your finger on. The reward is something that is so great that most of the people following him here, the inner core, the 12 disciples, most of them died believing it and saying, my life was worth something. My life counted for something. And I think that's the desire of every human heart in this room. I want to live a life that when I look back, I have no regrets, and I say it mattered, it counted, and I invested my life in what counted most. Because we're all looking around, kind of like investors. We've got $10 in our pocket, and we want to know which business is the one to invest it in. And that's how we look at our lives sometimes. This is my life, and I don't want to put it where it doesn't matter. I don't want to put my life and invest it in something that isn't going to count. And millions of people right now in our country, they're throwing their life at money. And here's the deal. When they die, it's going to be done. It's going to be over. That money doesn't care about them. That job doesn't care about them. That career doesn't care about them. And so what we've got to do is we've got to be selective and say, what can I put my life into? What can I commit my life to that is going to have the most consequences here on earth and in eternity following my life here on earth? That is following Jesus, and that is what it means to follow Jesus. It means that I've calculated the cost and I've said, this is what it looks like if I follow fame and fortune. Truth of the matter is most of us won't get it. But even if you do, this is the reward. This is the risk. This is the reward. This is what it looks like if I give my life to following and doing whatever pleases me, whatever feels good in the moment. And that could go as far as drugs, or that could just be something that you enjoy doing that you know is separating you from your family, is separating you from your career, from your work, whatever it might be. There are little investments we make with our time every day, with our lives every day. And Jesus said, I want you to calculate and I want you to count. What is it going to cost you to follow me? But what's the reward? When you came into church this morning, you probably saw some people who were just way too happy this morning for that early. You know what I mean? Either they had too much coffee or they didn't know it was cold outside. That's joy, okay? And a lot of them, a lot of them, it's not a show. It's not something they put on Sunday, because I see them on Tuesday afternoon after a hard day at work. And they manage to pull a smile off. They manage to have joy in spite of it. The rewards for following Jesus, they're not monetary. You'll never hear me preach a prosperity gospel here. I'm never going to tell you that if you come to church and do what's right and put your money in the plate, Jesus is going to bless you with financial rewards, because he never said that, okay? And if he didn't say it, did you get that from that? Because I didn't. I got the opposite. Following me is going to cost you something. It's going to be hard. It's going to be the opposite of rewarding in that sense. But here's what I would say. It's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. So this morning, I want to invite you to follow Jesus, but I want you to count the cost. I want you to know that it's not always going to be easy. I want you to know that that's why we have church. Do you know why the early believers met in homes and in large gatherings and in small gatherings? Because they needed the encouragement from one another. Some of you don't know the benefit of church attendance yet because you haven't faced adversity and trials yet. But when you face those, suddenly small groups make perfect sense to you. Suddenly going to church on a regular basis makes perfect sense because I have that encouragement and I have that group of people that I can trust. And that's a part of following Jesus. There's community there that is not found anywhere else. When you look around this room, you probably notice there's a lot of people here who look like you and who don't look like you. There's some people here who are about your age and who are maybe a little older, maybe a little younger. We like to encourage that because that was what the movement that followed Jesus looked like. There was no age requirement. There was no social status. There were no laws in Jesus' church where only this type of people could come, but not this type of people. You want to know why the early church grew so quickly? Because for the first time, they loved people passionately who looked like them and who didn't look like them, who spoke their language and didn't speak their language, and that was a big deal back then, who practiced their cultural understanding of things and who didn't. This was completely countercultural. The Romans hung out with Romans. The Jews hung out with Jews. All these people hung out in their little groups, and Jesus said, I came so that you would emphasize not what you don't have in common, but who you have in common, and that is me. And that's why the church grew. And so this morning, I want you to know the church, for the first time, offered something that nothing else could. Throughout history, not every church is this way, and our church isn't like maybe it should be, but through history, there has never been a more diverse, a more culturally open group of people than the Church of Jesus Christ. It works where they speak this language. It works where they speak that language. It works where they like that music. It works where they like that music. It works where they wear this to church. It works where they wear that to church. It works in villages. It works in metropolises. It works in third world countries. It works in first world nations. It works because it is not based on culture. It is not based on preference. It's based on Jesus. And it offers something that the human heart wants and desires. Every culture wants money. Every culture wants income. Every culture wants to be fed. But every culture also has another desire and another need inside of them. And it is purpose, it is hope, it is joy, it is grace. And the church, Jesus Christ himself, offers that. So when following him comes down to it, people are willing to say, I will die because I found something beyond what this life has to offer. And this life does have much to offer. Don't let me talk it down. There is something to be said for having money. We live in one of the wealthiest nations on earth, and we're in a very expensive building this morning. But money will only take you so far. There is something to be said for having more food than we know what to do with. There are people around the world that would die to know what's in your pantry this morning, that would die to know how much food you have frozen and saved up. They can't imagine living a life where you have 2 weeks worth of food stockpiled. That's never crossed their mind. So there's something to be said about having enough to meet your needs. But don't miss this. We can miss this sometimes. There's also something that having your needs met, that having money, that having a successful career, feeling like you've got it all together, there's something that just isn't enough there. And you could tell me I'm lying. You could tell me I'm not telling the truth. But we have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So I'm telling you money's not where it's at. I'm telling you, having it all together is not where it's at. There's something missing in the human condition and in the human spirit. And Jesus came to meet that need. So you can say I'm crazy, you can say it's nuts, and it sounds nuts, but Jesus knew that as crazy as it sounds, he was pinpointing something that everybody had struggled with and had dealt with. So this morning, I've given you all these risks. I've given you all these reasons not to do something, but here's the crazy part. In the last couple of weeks, we've had 21 people say, I want to commit my life to following Jesus. I know it's crazy, I know it sounds stupid, I know it sounds nuts, but I need something, and this life is not doing it for me. This world is not doing it for me. So as crazy as it was and as crazy as it still is, it still works. And it doesn't work because I work it. It doesn't work because of Travis or Kevin or any of us, because it worked before we came on the scene. You know what I'm saying? It's going to work long after we're off the scene. It works because Jesus works. He took care of it. He took care of our greatest need. This morning, I want you to know the risks, but I want you to know the reward is so much greater than anything else you'll ever find here on this planet. We live in a society that has found the bottom of everything. We found the bottom of what it means to have enough food. We've gotten all the way to where there's so much we don't know what to do with it. We throw away more food than we know what to do with. We live in a society that many people have found the bottom of endless amounts of, copious amounts of alcohol. They found the bottom. When you were a teenager, you thought, man, if I could just get out and party. We have a generation that has found the bottom of partying. There comes a point where you have partied so much you don't want to party anymore, and that just didn't do it. We live in a generation, we live in a world where people have found the bottom of success. We have billionaires here, billionaires, and it's still not enough. I'm telling you, this world has so much to offer, but every one of them, they have a bottom. There's a limit to what it can do and what it can fulfill in your life. Jesus says, there's no bottom with me. My grace is rich. My grace is deeper every day. You'll never find the end of my grace. You'll never find the end of my hope. And he says, what I'm offering is so much greater. So this morning, I want to encourage you, hey, follow Jesus, but know what you're getting into. But know it's worth it. You know what I mean? I like it when somebody's honest with me, and they're like, man, it's going to be hard. Okay. But it's going to be worth it. Don't just tell me it's going to be hard. Like, it's hard. There's no reason to do it. No, it's going to be hard. But it's the greatest decision you'll ever make. So if you're here this morning and you're a skeptic or you're not sure, I want you to know following Jesus is the greatest decision, but it's also the hardest decision that you'll ever make. So what's it going to be? Will you follow him? Or is it just too much? Is the cost too high?